The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows of Westfield International Airport as Margaret Johnson adjusted her simple pearl earrings. At 68 years old, she carried herself with the quiet dignity that comes from decades of breaking barriers in the business world. Today she wore a modest navy pantsuit, comfortable for travel, but those with a trained eye might notice the impeccable tailoring and subtle quality of the fabric. Margaret checked her boarding pass one more time. Summit Airlines, Flight 437, First Class, Seat 2A. She smiled to herself. First class wasn't something she particularly cared about these days, but her assistant had insisted on booking it. "You deserve comfort," Diane had said, not knowing the real reason Margaret was taking this flight. The boarding process began efficiently enough. Margaret waited patiently in the priority line, observing everything with sharp eyes that missed nothing despite her age. When it was her turn, she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, who smiled genuinely. "Welcome aboard. Ms. Johnson, enjoy your flight." Margaret nodded politely and made her way down the jet bridge, pulling her small carry-on behind her. As she approached the aircraft door, she took a deep breath, mentally shifting into observation mode. Flight attendant Alexis Reed stood at the entrance, greeting passengers with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was in her mid-30s, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, her Summit Airlines uniform pressed to perfection. What wasn't perfect was the tension evident in the tight line of her shoulders. "Good morning," Alexis said automatically as Margaret approached. "Good morning," Margaret replied warmly. "Lovely day for flying." Alexis barely registered the comment as she glanced at Margaret's boarding pass. "First class is to your left." Margaret made her way to her seat, stowing her small bag in the overhead compartment without assistance, though a male flight attendant rushed over to help. "I've got it, thank you," she assured him with a smile that made him pause, slightly surprised by her warmth. She settled into the comfortable seat and took out a small notebook and pen. The leather-bound book had seen better days, but Margaret preferred it to digital alternatives. People tended to ignore an old woman writing in a notebook. They assumed she was jotting down recipes or notes to grandchildren, not evaluating a multi-billion-dollar company's customer service. The first-class cabin filled gradually. A white businessman in an expensive suit took the seat beside Margaret, giving her a brief dismissive glance before becoming absorbed in his phone. Margaret simply smiled to herself and continued making notes about the boarding process. 10 minutes before departure, commotion erupted at the front of the cabin. A loud, demanding voice carried throughout the space. "This is completely unacceptable. I specifically booked 2A. Margaret looked up to see a well-dressed man in his 40s, red-faced and waving his boarding pass at Alexis, who had stepped into the cabin to address the situation. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but your boarding pass clearly shows seat 5C, Alexis explained, her voice strained but professional. "There's been a mistake. I always sit in 2A. I'm a Platinum Elite member, for God's sake." Margaret watched the interaction with interest. The man, clearly used to getting his way, continued to argue despite Alexis showing him his assigned seat on his boarding pass. The confrontation was beginning to delay departure. Alexis glanced around the cabin, her eyes landing on Margaret. Something flickered across her face, a calculation, a decision being made. She leaned closer to the angry passenger and lowered her voice, though Margaret could still hear every word. "Sir, perhaps we can work something out. Please give me a moment." Alexis approached Margaret with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ma'am, we seem to have a situation with our seating arrangements today." Margaret looked up with a neutral expression. "Is there a problem?" "Well," Alexis continued, her voice taking on a condescending tone one might use with a child or someone who might not understand complex matters. "We have a very important frequent flyer who seems to have been assigned the wrong seat. There appears to have been a computer error with your booking as well." Margaret raised an eyebrow slightly. "An error? My boarding pass shows seat 2A, which is this seat right here." Alexis's smile tightened further. "Yes, well, these things happen. Our system sometimes makes mistakes. I'm sure you'll be just as comfortable in another seat we've arranged for you," Margaret noticed how Alexis emphasized comfortable, as though offering a special treat to someone who should be grateful for any consideration. She also noticed how Alexis never made direct eye contact, instead looking somewhere over Margaret's shoulder as if she wasn't worth the full attention. I see, Margaret said quietly. And where would this other seat be located? We found you a nice spot in our economy section, Alexis said, gesturing vaguely toward the back of the plane. I can help you move your things. The businessman next to Margaret pretended to be absorbed in his phone but was clearly listening. A few other passengers were watching the interaction with uncomfortable expressions, but no one spoke up. Margaret considered her options. She could certainly assert her right to remain in her assigned seat. One word about her actual position would end this charade immediately, but that would defeat the purpose of today's journey. I understand, Margaret said finally, gathering her notebook and small handbag. Lead the way. Alexis seemed surprised by the lack of resistance but quickly composed herself. Thank you for your cooperation. This way, please. As Margaret stood, she noticed the angry passenger watching with poorly concealed satisfaction. He had already placed his expensive briefcase on her vacated seat. Margaret followed Alexis through the premium cabin and past the Economy Plus section. With each step further back into the aircraft, Alexis's attentiveness visibly diminished. By the time they reached the rear economy section, Alexis was walking several paces ahead, barely checking if Margaret was keeping up. Here we are, Alexis announced, stopping at a middle seat in the third-to-last row. 32E. The seat was wedged between two already occupied ones, a teenager with headphones blasting audible music on the aisle, and a heavy-set man already encroaching on the middle space by the window. This is the only available seat? Margaret asked, her voice steady. Alexis nodded briskly. It's a completely full flight. We're actually overbooked. She reached for Margaret's carry-on. Let me help you find space for this. No need, Margaret said, noticing there was no overhead space nearby anyway. I'll keep it under the seat in front of me. Suit yourself, Alexis replied with a shrug. The safety demonstration will begin shortly. A flight attendant will be by with beverage service after takeoff. Her dismissive tone made it clear that Margaret's concerns were no longer a priority. As Alexis turned to leave, Margaret spoke again. Excuse me, may I have your name, please? Alexis paused, turning back with a flash of annoyance that she quickly masked. Alexis Reed, is there something else you need? No thank you, Ms. Reed. I'd just like to know who's helping me. Alexis gave a curt nod and hurried back toward the front of the plane, where more important passengers waited. Margaret squeezed into the middle seat, placing her small bag under the seat in front as promised. The man by the window sighed dramatically at having to share his extended space. The teenager didn't even look up. As the safety demonstration began, Margaret opened her notebook again and made several careful notes. Her handwriting was neat and precise, betraying none of the thoughts running through her mind. Anyone looking over her shoulder might have been surprised to see not complaints, but detailed observations about staffing levels, passenger demographics, service protocols, and employee behavior patterns. In the front of the plane, the disgruntled passenger who had taken her seat was now being served a pre-departure champagne by a smiling Alexis. Margaret noted this too, watching how differently the flight attendant carried herself when dealing with certain passengers. The plane pushed back from the gate, and the familiar rumble of the engines filled the cabin. As they taxied toward the runway, Margaret closed her notebook and looked out past her seatmate to the airport slowly moving by outside the window. This wasn't the first time in her life she had been moved to the back based on someone's quick judgment of who she was, or more accurately, who they thought she was. But unlike those earlier times, today she had the power to do something about it, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been unfairly judged and dismissed. She settled back into the uncomfortable middle seat, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. By the time this flight landed, she would have everything she needed for the changes that were about to come to Summit Airlines. The plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the sky, carrying with it one passenger whose presence would change the company forever. 20 years earlier, Margaret Johnson had been sitting in a very different seat, behind a small desk in a cramped office with peeling wallpaper and a window unit air conditioner that rattled more than it cooled. Back then, she was a mid-level manager at a regional transportation authority, fighting twice as hard for half the recognition of her colleagues. You need to understand how these things work, her boss had told her after passing her over for promotion the third time. People need to feel comfortable with the face of leadership. He hadn't needed to explain what he meant by the face. Margaret understood perfectly well. That same night, she'd gone home to her modest two-bedroom apartment and made a decision that would change everything. If the existing companies wouldn't value her talents, she would build something new, something that operated on merit and treated everyone with dignity, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. Starting with her life savings and a small business loan, Margaret founded Johnson Transportation Consulting. The first few years were lean and difficult. She worked 18-hour days, slept on an office couch, and poured everything into building client relationships. What began as a small consultancy, helping regional bus companies optimize their routes, gradually expanded into aviation, railways, and eventually global transportation logistics. 15 years after that difficult conversation with her former boss, Margaret's firm had grown into Johnson Global Partners, a powerhouse that specialized in turning around struggling transportation companies. Her reputation for transforming toxic corporate cultures while simultaneously improving the bottom line made her the most sought-after consultant in the industry, which brought her to today, sitting uncomfortably in seat 32E on Summit Airlines Flight 437. 6 months ago, the board of Meridian Holdings, the parent company that owned Summit Airlines, had approached Margaret with an unusual proposal. They didn't just want to hire her firm for consultation. They wanted her to come on as CEO and completely overhaul the company. Summit is bleeding money, board chairman Richard Wilson had explained during their meeting. But more concerning is that we're bleeding talent and customer loyalty. Our service ratings have plummeted over the past 3 years. Margaret had initially declined. At 68, she was thinking more about stepping back from daily operations, not taking on a massive corporate turnaround. But something about the challenge intrigued her. Before I consider this offer, she had told the board, I need to experience your airline as a regular customer. No special treatment, no announcements. I want to see exactly what your passengers see. The board had agreed, never imagining that no special treatment would include their potential CEO being removed from her assigned first-class seat and relegated to the back of the plane. As the flight reached cruising altitude, Margaret opened her eyes. The businessman who had taken her first-class seat would be enjoying a hot towel and drink service by now. Back here in row 32, the overhead reading light flickered intermittently, and the air vent produced only the weakest stream of cool air. The teenager beside Margaret had fallen asleep, head lolling dangerously close to her shoulder. On her other side, the large man had claimed both armrests and was snoring softly. Margaret shifted in the narrow seat and pulled out her notebook again. This was actually her third secret shopper flight on Summit in the past month. The first 2 had been uneventful. Not particularly good service, but nothing like today's experience. This kind of inconsistency was telling. It suggested a company without clear standards or accountability. Margaret thought about Alexis Reed, the flight attendant who had so easily dismissed her. She wondered what the young woman's story might be. In Margaret's experience, employees rarely behaved poorly in a vacuum. There was almost always a systemic issue behind individual failures. She flipped back through her notebook to the research she'd compiled on Summit. Employee satisfaction had dropped 40% in the past 5 years. Turnover rates among flight attendants were nearly double the industry average. The previous management had cut staff benefits while increasing workloads, a recipe for disaster in the service industry. What Margaret saw wasn't just a problem with Alexis Reed. It was a company that had lost its way. The drink cart finally made its way to the back of the plane. A different flight attendant was serving this section, a young man with kind eyes and a genuine, if tired, smile. "What can I get for you?" he asked when he reached Margaret's row. "Just water, please," Margaret replied. "No ice, I'm coming right up." He poured the water carefully and handed it to her. "Anything else I can do to make your flight more comfortable?" The question seemed sincere, unlike the rehearsed pleasantries she'd encountered earlier. "What's your name?" Margaret asked. "David Chen," he answered, looking slightly surprised at the personal question. "I've been with Summit for about 2 years now." "Do you enjoy working here, David?" David glanced up and down the aisle, making sure no supervisors were within earshot. "It has its moments," he said diplomatically. "Some days are better than others. And today?" A brief shadow crossed his face. "Today's been challenging. We're understaffed again. That's happening more and more lately." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for the water, David, and for your honesty." He gave her a curious look before moving on to the next row. Margaret made another note in her book. Halfway through the flight, Margaret needed to use the restroom. She excused herself past the sleeping teenager and made her way toward the back lavatory. As she waited in line, she overheard two flight attendants talking in the galley, unaware of her presence. "I can't believe Alexis pulled that stunt again," one was saying, moving passengers around to please the entitled ones. "What did you expect?" The other replied, "Management rewards that behavior. Remember last month when that vice president wrote a commendation letter because she gave him someone else's first-class meal? It's not right. We're supposed to treat everyone the same." "Yeah, well, tell that to corporate. They're all about the high-value customers now. Everyone else can suffer." Margaret slipped back into the line before they noticed her. Another note went into her book. When she returned to her seat, the large man by the window was awake and looking at his phone. The teenager was still asleep, now with headphones askew. Margaret settled back in, considering what she'd learned so far. Summit's problems ran deeper than she had initially thought. This wasn't just about service failures or cost-cutting. This was about a fundamental misalignment of values. The company had created a culture where employees believed that treating certain customers better than others was not just acceptable, but rewarded. If Margaret took this job, and that remained a big if, she would need to transform more than policies and procedures. She would need to rebuild the entire corporate philosophy from the ground up. Her thoughts were interrupted when David appeared at her side. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "I noticed you didn't get any snacks earlier. We have some extra cookies if you'd like one." Margaret smiled. "That would be lovely, thank you." He handed her a small package. "It's not much, I know. To be honest, they've been cutting back on everything, even these little touches that make people feel cared for." "How long have these cutbacks been happening?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious. David seemed surprised by her interest, but answered anyway. "About 3 years now, ever since the merger with Continental Express. The new management came in with all these promises about synergy and growth, but all they've done is slash budgets and squeeze more work out of fewer people. That must be difficult for the staff." "It is," David sighed. "Most of us got into this job because we love helping people, you know? Making their journeys better. Now we barely have time to do the basics, let alone go the extra mile." Margaret nodded. "I understand." "Anyway," David said, suddenly self-conscious, "enjoy the cookie. Let me know if you need anything else." As he walked away, Margaret made a final note in her book before closing it decisively. She had seen enough. The board had been right. Summit Airlines needed a complete overhaul. But what they hadn't mentioned was how deeply the problems had penetrated every aspect of the operation. The challenge would be enormous. She would need to rebuild trust with employees who had been mistreated for years. She would need to redefine success metrics that had been focused solely on short-term profits. She would need to create systems that rewarded the right behaviors and corrected the wrong ones. And she would need to start with people like Alexis Reed, not to punish them, but to understand how the company had shaped their actions and attitudes. Margaret looked out the window at the clouds below. There was something poetic about viewing problems from 30,000 feet. You could see the patterns more clearly from up here, see how all the pieces connected. As the plane began its initial descent, Margaret had made her decision. She would accept the CEO position at Meridian Holdings, and her first official act would happen the moment this plane landed. She smiled to herself, thinking of Alexis Reed's face when she realized whom she had moved to the back of the plane. But the satisfaction would be fleeting. The real work, the important work, would come after. When they began the difficult journey of transforming Summit Airlines into the company it should have been all along. The fasten seatbelt sign illuminated with a soft ding. Margaret buckled up, ready for both the landing and what would come next. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing Margaret to grip the armrests. The teenager beside her finally woke up, blinking in confusion and adjusting his headphones. The drink service had ended, and most passengers had settled into the quiet rhythm of mid-flight activities, reading, watching movies, or attempting to sleep in the cramped economy seats. Margaret observed the cabin with careful attention. 3 rows ahead, a mother struggled to calm a fussy toddler while fellow passengers shot annoyed glances her way. Across the aisle, an elderly couple shared a single blanket, huddled together against the cabin's chill. Near the galley, a businessman repeatedly pressed his call button, his face growing increasingly impatient when no one immediately responded. These small moments told Margaret more about Summit Airlines than any financial report could. The real story of a company wasn't in its quarterly earnings or stock price. It was in how people experienced its service, how employees responded under pressure, how systems either supported or failed those on the front lines. Alexis appeared briefly in the economy cabin, moving quickly through the aisle on her way to the back galley. Her eyes swept past Margaret without recognition. In the brief glimpse Margaret caught of her face, she noted the flight attendant's tense expression and the dark circles under her eyes partially hidden by makeup. 20 minutes later, David returned with the beverage cart for a second service. When he reached Margaret's row, he offered a genuine smile. "How are you doing back here? Can I get you anything else?" "I'd love some hot tea if you have it," Margaret replied. "Of course." David prepared the tea with care, placing a napkin on her tray table before setting down the cup. "I added an extra honey packet. The air gets so dry on these flights." "Thank you, David. That's very thoughtful." Margaret stirred her tea slowly. "Have you always wanted to be a flight attendant?" The question seemed to surprise him. Passengers rarely asked about flight attendants as people with dreams and aspirations. "Actually, I'm studying healthcare administration," David said, keeping his voice low as he continued serving the row. "This job helps pay for my master's degree. The flight schedule can work around classes, and the travel benefits let me visit my parents in Taiwan a couple times a year." "That's wonderful. Healthcare needs good administrators," David nodded. "That's the goal. My mom was a nurse for 30 years. I saw how much the right leadership, or the wrong leadership, affected her daily work life." He glanced toward the front of the plane. "Kinda like here, actually." Margaret took a sip of her tea. "How so?" David hesitated, then continued in an even quieter voice. "When I started, there was the senior flight attendant, Grace, who ran the cabin like a community. Everyone had each other's backs. Passengers were happier because we were happier." His expression darkened slightly. Then the new management came in, cut staffing levels, added more flights with shorter turnarounds. Grace eventually quit. "A lot of the good ones did. And the ones who stayed?" Margaret asked. "Some like me need the job for now, others—" He shrugged. "They adapted to the new normal. Started looking out for themselves, playing politics, competing for the easy flights and premium assignments." His eyes flickered toward the front of the plane, where Alexis would be serving the first-class cabin. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "It's hard to be your best self in a broken system." "Exactly." David looked surprised and pleased at her understanding. "Anyway, enjoy your tea. I should keep going." As David moved on, Margaret pulled out her notebook again. This conversation had confirmed something she'd suspected. Summit's problems weren't just about individual employees making poor choices. The company had systematically dismantled the conditions that allowed good service to flourish. Margaret flipped back through her notes from previous flights and meetings. The pattern was clear. 3 years ago, following the merger, Summit had embarked on an aggressive cost-cutting strategy. They'd reduced training hours for new hires by 40%. They'd eliminated crew meals on shorter flights. They'd increased required flying hours while reducing guaranteed rest periods. The message to employees had been clear. Numbers matter more than people. And inevitably, the employees had passed that message along to passengers. Margaret was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice Alexis approaching until the flight attendant was standing right beside her. "Ma'am, I need to check if your seatbelt is fastened," Alexis said briskly, not making eye contact. "We're expecting more turbulence." Margaret looked up. "It's fastened, thank you." Alexis was already moving to the next row when Margaret spoke again. "Excuse me, Ms. Reed." Alexis turned back, her professional mask firmly in place. "Yes? I was wondering if I might get a blanket. It's quite chilly back here." A flicker of irritation crossed Alexis's face. "I'm sorry, our blankets are complimentary in first class only. They're available for purchase in economy for $8. "I see," Margaret said. "And if I were still in my originally assigned first-class seat, I would have received one." Alexis's expression tightened. "As I explained earlier, there was a seating error that needed to be corrected. If you'd like to purchase a blanket, I can bring you one." Margaret shook her head. "No, thank you. I was just curious about the policy." Alexis gave a curt nod and continued down the aisle. As she walked away, Margaret noticed David watching the interaction from the galley, a concerned expression on his face. A few minutes later, David appeared at Margaret's side. discreetly placing a folded blanket on her tray table. "Company policy says we're supposed to make exceptions for elderly passengers," he whispered with a small wink. "I'm just following the rules," Margaret smiled. "Thank you, David." After David left, Margaret wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and returned to her observations. The contrast between the two flight attendants couldn't have been more stark. Same uniform, same job description, same working conditions, yet entirely different approaches to service. What made the difference? Was it just personality, training? Or was there something deeper at work? Margaret thought about her own company, Johnson Global Partners. She had built it on a simple premise: treat your employees the way you want them to treat your customers. She provided generous benefits, encouraged work-life balance, recognized achievement, and created pathways for advancement based on merit rather than politics. The result was a loyal workforce that consistently delivered exceptional service. Summit Airlines had clearly lost sight of this fundamental principle. They had created a system that rewarded the wrong behaviors and punished the right ones. They had forgotten that their most valuable asset wasn't their fleet of planes or their route network. It was their people. As the flight continued, Margaret noticed more telling details. The first-class cabin received frequent check-ins and attentive service, while the economy cabin was largely ignored outside of required service periods. When the drink cart came through economy a third time, it was rushed, with flight attendants barely making eye contact with passengers. Through it all, Margaret kept writing in her notebook, filling page after page with observations and ideas. By the time the captain announced their initial descent, she had the beginnings of a transformation plan sketched out. It would start with people. New training programs, yes, but also new incentive structures that rewarded collaborative success, rather than individual performance metrics. It would include revised staffing levels that prioritize service quality over short-term cost savings. Most importantly, it would require a complete cultural reset, a return to the fundamental values of respect, dignity, and excellence that had once made Summit Airlines an industry leader. As the plane began its descent, Margaret closed her notebook and tucked it into her bag. The real work would begin soon, but first there was the matter of Alexis Reed. Margaret had seen enough of corporate America to know how these situations typically played out. A complaint would be filed. An employee would be disciplined or fired. A policy memo would be distributed reminding staff to avoid discriminatory behavior. Nothing would really change. But Margaret had something else in mind. Something that might actually address the root causes rather than just treating the symptoms. The plane descended through clouds, emerging into clear skies over the city below. Margaret could see the airport in the distance, a complex network of runways and terminals bustling with activity. From this height, individual people were invisible, just as they often were to corporate decision-makers focused on spreadsheets and stock prices. But Margaret had never forgotten what it was like on the ground, what it felt like to be dismissed, undervalued, or pushed to the back of the plane. That perspective would inform everything she did as CEO of Meridian Holdings. The aircraft touched down with a gentle bump, and passengers around Margaret began gathering their belongings, eager to deplane. The teenager beside her immediately stood up despite the seatbelt sign still being illuminated. The large man by the window sighed heavily as he struggled to retrieve his bag from the overhead bin. Margaret remained seated, in no rush to exit. She knew exactly what would happen when she made her way to the front of the aircraft. She could picture Alexis's face when the realization dawned. But that moment of shock wasn't what Margaret was after. She was looking beyond that moment, to the real opportunity it presented, the chance to begin the process of healing and transformation that Summit Airlines so desperately needed. As the seatbelt sign finally turned off and passengers began shuffling toward the exits, Margaret gathered her belongings and prepared to step into her new role. Not just as CEO, but as a catalyst for change in a company that had lost its way. The journey was about to begin. The plane had come to a complete stop at the gate. But as always happens, passengers immediately jumped to their feet, crowding the aisle in their rush to deplane. Margaret remained seated, watching the ritual with quiet amusement. No matter how many times the flight attendants announced that deplaning would happen by rows, human nature prevailed. Everyone wanted to be first. "You can go ahead," the large man by the window told her. gesturing to the aisle where people were slowly shuffling forward. "Thank you. But I'm in no hurry," Margaret replied with a smile. "I find it's easier to wait until the crowd thins out." The truth was, Margaret had a very specific reason for wanting to be one of the last passengers off the plane. She opened her notebook one last time, reviewing the notes she'd made throughout the flight. On the final page, she'd written a list of names: David Chen, Alexis Reed, and 3 other flight attendants whose name tags she'd managed to glimpse during the flight. The line of departing passengers gradually moved forward. Up at the front of the plane, Margaret could see Alexis standing by the door, saying a practiced, "Thank you for flying with us," to each passing passenger. Her eyes already focused on the next person before the current one had fully moved past her. After about 15 minutes, the crowd had thinned considerably. Margaret gathered her belongings and finally stood, nodding politely to the cleanup crew who had already begun preparing the aircraft for its next flight. She made her way slowly up the aisle, taking in the details of the cabin one last time: the worn seat covers, the scuffed overhead bins, the outdated entertainment systems. All of these would need updating in the coming months. As she approached the front of the plane, Margaret could see the flight deck door was open. The captain and first officer were completing their post-flight checks, their voices drifting into the cabin as they discussed the minor turbulence they'd encountered. Alexis was still at her post by the exit door, though her professional smile had grown increasingly strained as the line of passengers dwindled. When she spotted Margaret approaching from the back, a flicker of recognition crossed her face, quickly replaced by her customer service mask. "Thank you for flying with us today," Alexis said automatically, already looking past Margaret to the handful of remaining passengers behind her. Margaret paused. "Actually, Ms. Reed, I wanted to thank you personally for your assistance earlier with the seating arrangement." Alexis's eyes snapped back to Margaret's face, wariness evident in her expression. She clearly expected a complaint or confrontation. "Just doing my job, ma'am. I hope the rest of your flight was comfortable." "It was quite illuminating," Margaret replied with a warm smile. "I learned a great deal." Before Alexis could respond, a voice called from the flight deck. "Is that her? Is she still on board?" The captain emerged from the cockpit, his eyes scanning the nearly empty cabin until they landed on Margaret. His face broke into a broad smile of recognition. "Ms. Johnson, I thought that was you on the manifest." He stepped forward, extending his hand. "Captain Robert Wilson, it's an honor to have you on our flight today. If I'd known you were with us, I would have welcomed you personally before takeoff." Margaret shook his hand. "Thank you, Captain Wilson. I preferred to travel anonymously today, just observing the regular passenger experience." Alexis had gone completely still beside them, her professional smile frozen on her face as the implications of the conversation began to sink in. "Of course," the captain nodded. "The board mentioned you might be doing some undercover work before officially taking the position. Smart approach. You'll get a much more accurate picture that way." "That was my hope," Margaret agreed. The first officer had stepped out of the cockpit as well, his curiosity evident. "Ms. Johnson?" As in Margaret Johnson? The new CEO? "Not quite yet," Margaret corrected gently. "The paperwork will be finalized next week. For now, I'm just a very interested observer." Alexis made a small, involuntary sound beside her, something between a gasp and a cough. Margaret turned to her with a kind smile. "Ms. Reed, are you feeling all right? You look a bit pale." Alexis's face had indeed lost all color. Her eyes were wide with horror as the full understanding of who she had relegated to the back of the plane crashed over her. You're the new CEO?" she stammered. "Soon to be," Margaret confirmed. "Though today I was simply a passenger on your flight." The remaining color drained from Alexis's face. "Ms. Johnson, I had no idea. The seating mix-up earlier. I was just trying to accommodate our platinum member, and I thought—" Margaret raised a hand, gently interrupting the panicked explanation. "We'll have time to discuss all of that later. For now, I'd just like to speak with the entire flight crew before we disembark." "Is that possible, Captain Wilson?" "Absolutely," the captain replied, clearly intrigued by the unfolding situation. "We can gather everyone in the forward galley." "Excellent. And could someone please find David Chen? He's working in the economy cabin today." The first officer volunteered to fetch David, disappearing down the aisle while Captain Wilson summoned the remaining flight attendants to the front of the plane. Alexis stood frozen in place, her eyes fixed on Margaret with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Within minutes, the entire flight crew had assembled in the forward galley. 5 flight attendants, the captain, and the first officer stood in a loose semicircle, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. David looked particularly confused, his eyes darting between Margaret and his colleagues. "Thank you all for gathering," Margaret began. "My name is Margaret Johnson. As some of you may have just learned, I'll be taking over as CEO of Meridian Holdings, Summit Airlines' parent company, next week." Murmurs rippled through the small group. David's eyes widened in surprise as he looked at Margaret with new understanding. "Today I experienced your airline as a regular passenger would. I observed many things, some concerning, some promising." Margaret's eyes moved from face to face, making brief contact with each crew member. "Rather than rush to judgment based on a single flight, I'd like to hear from all of you. What's working well at Summit Airlines? What needs to change? What would help you provide better service to your passengers?" The crew exchanged uncertain glances. This was clearly not what they had expected. After a moment of hesitation, Captain Wilson spoke up. "Maintenance has been an issue. We've had increasing delays due to deferred maintenance schedules. It's not affecting safety yet, but it's impacting our on-time performance." Margaret nodded, making a note in her book. "Thank you, Captain. What else?" Gradually, other crew members began to speak. The purser mentioned staffing shortages. Another flight attendant brought up outdated equipment. The first officer talked about scheduling problems that left crews exhausted. Throughout it all, Alexis remained silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. Finally, Margaret turned to David. "Mr. Chen, you mentioned earlier that things were different when you first started. Could you elaborate on what's changed?" David hesitated, glancing at his colleagues before answering. "When I joined, there was a real sense of teamwork. We had enough staff to cover for each other if someone needed a break. We had time to properly prepare the cabin between flights. Most importantly, we were encouraged to solve problems for passengers rather than just follow rigid protocols. And now," Margaret prompted. "Now it feels like we're just trying to survive each flight," David said quietly. "There's no time to do anything beyond the bare minimum." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you all for your candor. I won't take up more of your time today, but this conversation has been invaluable." She closed her notebook and slipped it into her bag. "I'd like to continue these discussions in the coming weeks as we develop our new strategy for Summit Airlines." The crew nodded, seemingly relieved that no one was being disciplined on the spot. "You're dismissed," Margaret said with a warm smile, "except for Ms. Reed and Mr. Chen. I'd like a word with both of you before I go." The other crew members filed out, leaving Alexis, David, and Margaret alone in the forward galley. Alexis looked like she might be sick, while David stood tall but clearly nervous. "Ms. Reed," Margaret began, her voice neither harsh nor accusatory, "I imagine this has been quite a shock for you." Alexis nodded, unable to meet Margaret's eyes. "Miss Johnson, I want to apologize for—" Margaret held up a hand. "Before you apologize, I'd like you to think about something. The way you treated me today, moving me to the back to accommodate a demanding passenger, denying me a blanket that I was entitled to, speaking to me condescendingly, was that in line with Summit Airlines' official policies?" Alexis swallowed hard. "Some of it was. The blanket policy is official. But the seat change was. I made a judgment call. Based on what?" Margaret asked gently. Alexis remained silent, the answer hanging unspoken between them. "I'm not asking these questions to embarrass you," Margaret continued. "I'm trying to understand if your actions today were the result of personal choices or company culture. Because if the company has created an environment where employees feel pressured to make these kinds of decisions, that's something I need to address at a systemic level." Alexis finally looked up. "Both," she admitted. "The company pushes us to prioritize high-value customers. There are bonuses for positive reviews from Platinum members, but the way I handled it—" "That was on me," Margaret nodded. "Thank you for your honesty." She turned to David. "Mr. Chen, you went out of your way to show kindness and respect to everyone in your section, regardless of their status. What drives that choice, especially in a system that doesn't seem to reward it?" David thought for a moment. "My grandmother always said that how you treat people when there's nothing in it for you reveals your true character. I guess I just try to live by that." A smile spread across Margaret's face. "Your grandmother was a wise woman." She turned back to Alexis. "I'm not firing you, Ms. Reed. Alexis's head snapped up in surprise. In fact, Margaret continued, I'd like both of you to be part of a new customer experience task force I'm forming. I need people who understand the current reality of Summit Airlines, both what works and what doesn't. You represent different approaches to service, and I believe you both have valuable perspectives to offer. Alexis looked stunned. You want me on your task force? After how I treated you? Precisely because of how you treated me, Margaret replied. You showed me exactly what needs to change at this airline, and I suspect that if we fix the underlying issues, employees like you will have the support and motivation to provide much better service. Margaret pulled 2 business cards from her bag, handing one to each of them. My direct line is on these cards. I'd like you both to report to the corporate headquarters next Monday at 9 a.m. for our first task force meeting. We have a lot of work to do. David accepted his card with an eager nod. Alexis took hers with trembling fingers, still processing this unexpected turn of events. Now, Margaret said, picking up her carry-on bag, I believe I have a meeting with the board in 30 minutes. It seems I have quite a lot to report. As she turned to leave, Margaret paused and looked back at Alexis with a gentle smile. Oh, and Ms. Reed, I think you might want to review the company policy on seat assignments. You'll find that it explicitly prohibits moving passengers based on the complaints of others, regardless of their status level. With that parting comment, Margaret Johnson walked off the plane, leaving behind 2 flight attendants with very different reactions to the encounter, and an airline that was about to undergo a profound transformation. 6 months had passed since that fateful flight. Margaret Johnson stood at the window of her corner office on the 40th floor of Meridian Tower, watching a Summit Airlines plane take off from the nearby airport. The aircraft sported a fresh paint job, part of the airline's rebranding effort that had begun 3 months ago. The new livery featured flowing blue and silver lines that represented connection and movement, replacing the stark, corporate design that had adorned the fleet for the past decade. The rebranding was just the most visible of many changes Margaret had implemented since taking over as CEO. Behind her, spread across her large conference table, were the latest customer satisfaction reports. The numbers told a story of remarkable transformation, a 47% increase in positive feedback, a 62% reduction in complaints, and most tellingly, a 28% improvement in employee satisfaction scores. A knock at her door pulled Margaret from her thoughts. Come in, she called, turning from the window. Diane, her assistant of 20 years who had followed her to this new position, stepped into the room. They're ready for you in the boardroom, Margaret. Thank you, Diane. Is everyone there? Yes, including the special guests you requested. Margaret nodded, gathering her tablet and a folder of printed materials. Perfect. Let's not keep them waiting. As she walked through the executive floor toward the boardroom, employees greeted her warmly. Unlike her predecessor, who had isolated himself behind layers of gatekeepers, Margaret made a point of being visible and accessible. She knew most employees by name and made regular visits to different departments, from maintenance hangars to reservation centers. When she reached the boardroom, the buzz of conversation stopped as all eyes turned to her. Around the long table sat the board of directors, senior executives, and 2 familiar faces that stood out from the crowd, Alexis Reed and David Chen, both now dressed in business attire rather than flight attendant uniforms. Good morning. Everyone, Margaret said, taking her place at the head of the table. Thank you for joining us for this 6-month review. Before we dive into the numbers, I want to remind us all why we're here. She tapped her tablet, and the large screen on the wall displayed a photograph of a Summit Airlines plane. 6 months ago, I experienced firsthand what had gone wrong with our airline. I was moved from my assigned seat because a high-tier member complained. I was treated as if I didn't matter because I didn't fit someone's idea of a valuable customer, and I discovered that this wasn't just one employee making poor choices. It was the result of systems and incentives that we had created. Margaret glanced at Alexis, who met her gaze steadily. The young woman had changed noticeably in the past 6 months. The defensive rigidity was gone from her posture, replaced by a calm confidence. Today, I'm proud to say we've begun to turn the ship around. But numbers only tell part of the story. Margaret looked around the table. I've invited Alexis Reed and David Chen to share their perspectives as members of our Customer Experience Task Force. They've been on the front lines of our transformation efforts, and I believe their insights are more valuable than any spreadsheet. Margaret nodded to David, who stood and addressed the room. 6 months ago, working for Summit Airlines felt like being set up to fail, he began. We were understaffed, undertrained, and given policies that made it nearly impossible to actually help our passengers. Flight attendants were pitted against each other for the better routes and schedules, which created a toxic environment where nobody wanted to help anybody else. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of a training session with flight attendants engaged in a role-playing exercise. The new training program Ms. Johnson implemented has completely changed how we approach our jobs. Instead of focusing just on procedures, we now spend time understanding the why behind our service standards. We learn how to make judgment calls that align with our core values rather than just following rigid rules. David continued, outlining the specific changes to staffing levels, scheduling practices, and onboard resources that had made the biggest difference for frontline employees. When he finished, Margaret thanked him and turned to Alexis. The boardroom fell silent as Alexis stood. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, aware of the incident that had brought her to Margaret's attention in the first place. 6 months ago, I made a decision that I'm not proud of, Alexis began, her voice steady despite the difficult subject. I moved a passenger from her assigned seat based on assumptions I made about her value to the airline. I didn't know that passenger was Ms. Johnson, but that's not the point. I shouldn't have done it regardless of who was sitting in that seat. Alexis looked directly at Margaret. What I've learned since then is that my actions that day weren't entirely my fault, but they weren't entirely the company's fault either. We both played a role. She clicked to a new slide showing the old and new incentive structures side by side. Under the old system, I was rewarded for making high-status passengers happy, even at the expense of other customers. My quarterly bonuses depended on it. There was no incentive to treat everyone with equal respect. She gestured to the right side of the slide. The new system evaluates us on how we handle difficult situations, how we solve problems creatively, and how we uphold the dignity of every passenger regardless of their status level. Alexis continued her presentation, sharing specific examples of how the cultural transformation had changed day-to-day operations. She spoke about the elimination of policies that created artificial scarcity, like charging for blankets in economy while giving them away in first class, and the implementation of new standards that emphasized humanity over rigid rule following. When both presentations concluded, the boardroom erupted in applause. The board chairman, Richard Wilson, turned to Margaret with undisguised admiration. Remarkable progress, Margaret. I think I speak for the entire board when I say you've exceeded our highest expectations. Margaret acknowledged the compliment with a nod. Thank you, Richard, but the real credit belongs to our employees. They were always capable of delivering exceptional service. They just needed the right support and the right systems. As the meeting continued, they reviewed the financial implications of the changes. The initial investment in additional staffing, training, and upgraded amenities had been substantial, but early returns were promising. Passenger numbers were increasing, and the airline had begun reclaiming market share it had lost over the past 5 years. We've still got a long way to go, Margaret cautioned as the meeting drew to a close. Cultural transformation doesn't happen overnight, but I believe we're on the right path. After the board meeting adjourned, Margaret asked Alexis and David to stay behind. When the room had emptied, she closed the door and turned to them with a warm smile. Excellent presentations, both of you. You've become powerful advocates for change. David grinned. It's easy to advocate for something when you believe in it so strongly. Alexis nodded in agreement. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually proud to wear the Summit Airlines uniform again. That means more to me than any financial report, Margaret said. She walked to the window, gesturing for them to join her. Below, they could see the airport in the distance where Summit planes were taking off and landing. I have a new assignment for both of you, Margaret said after a moment. We've been focused on fixing what was broken. Now it's time to innovate, to create service experiences that no other airline is offering. She handed them each a folder containing her proposal for a new passenger advocacy program. I want you to co-lead this initiative. You'll select a team from across the company, flight attendants, gate agents, baggage handlers, everyone who touches the passenger experience. Your mission is to reimagine air travel from the ground up. David opened his folder eagerly, already scanning the contents. Alexis, however, looked up at Margaret with a question in her eyes. Why me? She asked quietly. After what happened, I would have understood if you'd fired me. Instead, you've given me opportunity after opportunity. Why? Margaret considered the question carefully. Because you remind me of myself at your age, Alexis. Talented, hardworking, but shaped by systems that didn't always bring out your best qualities. She placed a hand on Alexis's shoulder, and because true transformation isn't about punishing past mistakes, it's about creating conditions where people can learn, grow, and contribute their very best. Alexis blinked rapidly, emotion evident on her face. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Margaret said with a smile. Now let's talk about your first assignment. Next week, I'm taking another flight, economy class, no special treatment, to see how far we've come. I'd like both of you to work the cabin. David laughed. Incognito again? Of course not, Margaret replied with a twinkle in her eye. This time I want everyone to know the CEO is flying economy by choice. I want them to see that we value every seat on that plane, not just the ones at the front. As they discussed the details of the upcoming flight, Margaret felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The airline still had challenges to overcome, but the transformation was well underway. What had begun with an uncomfortable seat at the back of the plane had blossomed into a company-wide renewal. Later that afternoon, as Margaret prepared to leave for the day, she paused at her office window one last time. Another Summit plane was taking off, carrying hundreds of passengers to their destinations. She wondered about their experiences, whether they could feel the difference in how they were being treated, whether the flight attendants serving them had the support they needed to do their best work. The true measure of her success wouldn't be found in quarterly reports or board presentations. It would be in moments she'd never witness: a flight attendant going the extra mile for a struggling parent, a gate agent finding a creative solution for a missed connection, a pilot taking time to reassure a nervous flyer. It would be in the stories passengers told about flying Summit Airlines, stories very different from the one that had begun 6 months ago, when a flight attendant had kicked an elderly black woman to the back of the plane, not knowing she would soon be the boss.